So
Your finger's better.
Well, you're sharing the same
What's
thing.
this one here?
we're sharing the same
Planning-
page. We'll
planning
come to
zone.
it.
Planning and zoning, how you fucking. Yeah, sit down here and shoot here. Keep you straight. So that's Rhonda.
Yeah.
You said.
Okay, looks like Ren joined us as well.
Candles on.
Kendall, yeah, there we go. Okay, on change.
Yeah, I was just gonna make sure that you guys can hear me real quick before we get going.
We can hear you.
Awesome. I'm jealous because pizza sounds awesome right now. You guys are making me hungry.
It's only a 3-hour drive.
I know, right? We got Mike too. So at some point you'll probably see him flash in front of the camera. So he's gonna be listening in on our side too.
Great.
All right, we're ready to kick off and get going.
Yes, I think we are all here that's gonna be here. We do have Ren Ren, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
All right, so with that, I'll just do a quick introduction because I don't think you guys have met me yet. So my name is Hannah Welch. I am a planner with Johnson & Milton Engineering. I also work real close with Mike Hansen, who at some point you'll see pop up here with Rural Community Consultants. We're kind of one big happy family. I've been helping out with the code update portion of the general plan update initiative, code rewrite project that we've got going on with the city. And so we thought we'd pull everybody together today because we're starting to get to the point where it's time to.
Sorry, garbage man came by, some dogs ran away, it was ugly, so.
So we thought we'd get together real quick to kind of walk you through kind of where we're at currently. And I know you guys have pizza in front of you here, but is there a way that we can get it so that I can share screen?
Yes, just one second. I should have done that already. Okay. All right, try it out.
Okay, let me try again. All right, there we go. So I know you guys have pizza in front of you, but in my spare time, I do cakes. So I had some fun thinking this graphic. So I thought this graphic might be kind of useful because code update processes can be kind of convoluted, and sometimes it's confusing, and you get kind of lost with kind of where you're currently at. So when I saw this image, I was like, hey, this is a perfect graphic, just in a real quick nutshell of the code update process, and kind of where we're at. And I thought this might help try to get us all going and get thinking. So these bottom two layers here, I should label these as part of the consultant. But we usually start here, and on code update projects, we usually start looking at your code and analyzing and doing a couple of passes. The first one being kind of for clarity and correctness issues. So obviously as codes get updated, over time, you might have internal conflicts, where one idea was mentioned in one section of the code but wasn't actually followed through on another. That's kind of what we mean by like the clarity and correctness pass. That's one of the first layers of review that we kind of go through when we start these big code update projects. The next layer is what I like to call a statutory and a best practice pass. And usually what we're looking at when we're going through the code with that scope or that layer is we're looking for conflicts with state statutes and also interjecting some thoughts on planning best practices. If we're in the land use titles, that's probably what's most applicable to the commission, which is why I thought I'd phrase it that way. But that's kind of the next pass. This green layer in here, this is where most recently we've been, and it's been us working with staff here at the city in order to incorporate staff feedback and things that staff need to have interjected into the code, because a lot of times staff ends up dealing with the day-to-day operations. So there's a lot of aspects sometimes that get left out of code update processes when we don't have time to work with staff and capture their feedback to make sure that we get enforcement provisions and things of that nature kind of incorporated into these big code update processes. And so we've been at this level here, and where we're moving to now, which is why we're having the discussion, is we're starting to get moving to the layer where it's time that we bring the planning commission into the discussion, because we've got a solid enough draft at this point where we feel that it's relevant to start going through kind of what we've identified through all those various reviews. To get kind of your thoughts and your feedback so that we can incorporate any of those kind of policy level discussions or thoughts incorporated into the draft document. And then ultimately at the end of the day with the code update process, through the public hearing process, we will be able to collect public feedback. And then ultimately at the planning commission, when it comes to land use related things, that we'll need to provide a recommendation to the council as to whether or not to adopt the proposed changes. So those are kind of your upper two tiers, with the, anything on top being council when they actually adopt. So I thought that would be kind of a fun graphic to start off with since we are meeting over lunch hour. Just to kind of summarize code update process, does that kind of make sense with where we're at, kind of why we're meeting?
Yeah, understood.
Okay, all right. I kind of wanted to keep the agenda for this meeting a little light. What I thought might be most beneficial, and Drew, feel free to jump in here and kind of help guide me with maybe things that we need to talk about. But I thought that it might be beneficial for me to kind of give you a summary of the red line changes that you've got kind of in front of you in these first two packets of material. I know sometimes when you dive into a document, those 30 and 40 pages and it's been marked up, and rewritten, sometimes it gets really hard to decipher kind of what is actually going on. So we've done kind of two things. So first, we usually kind of give these high-level summaries. That way, if there's any questions, we can help answer those. But the other thing too is so that we can also kind of explain the layout that we're presenting the documents to you in. And so for your agenda items, we have what we call a policy discussion catalog. So for things that we may not get a chance to talk about today, just know that you always have these policy discussion catalogs for these titles that we're working on for you. And within these policy discussion catalogs, we break them down into different categories. And I try to do it by chapter, where I give you kind of a general summary as to all of the red line changes that are being incorporated or interjected into that specific section. So that if we don't, happen to get a chance to talk about it today, as you guys are working through those red lines, know that you can always come back to this policy discussion catalog. And you can kind of read the brief little summary that we pulled together for you. The intent behind this document is so that it just, like I said, people get bogged down in the red lines. So this just kind of helps to facilitate that and give you points for talking points, and so that you can note where you really need to have the policy discussion catalog or the policy discussions. So this document here, which you guys should have had links sent to you for, any of the links that you got in those packets, y'all have comment rights on these. So if you want to review the documents electronically, feel free to do so, and just know that if you want to come in here and drop your notes, you can do that on both the policy discussion catalog and the actual red line file. Anytime you guys drop review comments into those documents, Mike and I, we actually get alerted that we have activity on those documents. And so what we find is that it just helps us be more collaborative as we kind of try to approach and take on, the various code updates.
Kendall?
Yes.
Real quick, sorry to interrupt you. On that note, we did have a councilman comment on the packets that were delivered to them. And we're not seeing that on our side. Is there a way that, are you seeing that and we are not, or is that turned off? Where we can't see or view?
Comments? No, I believe, I might have to check. I thought, the comments, when they get displayed, they're publicly available for everybody, so if there is a comment that everybody can see it, but I may need to double check that because Mike and I are always logged in and we're always the owners of these documents. I don't know, Mike, have you ever tried logging in as somebody who's not to see if they see those comments as well? Yeah, I don't think so. So, let me take a look at that. So let me see if they all publicly display. I believe they should, but we can get to the bottom of that and see if there is or not, a setting that we can maybe toggle on to make them all publicly available to view, whether or not you're logged in or not.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, what I'll do now, I tried to take Title 15 and 16 on purpose, to start rolling, out kind of these conversations. And I usually pick these two titles, for the sheer purpose of is most of the time the amendments that need to be made within these sections, are gonna be very statutorily driven. And what I mean by that is when it comes to building and construction codes, for example, the state has already adopted, the state construction codes. And the state also dictates the version of those codes. And so when we actually take a look at what the, city currently has on file, in Title 15, sorry, let me scroll up here to the top real quick. Kind of what we found when we started looking at the material that is in the current Title 15, it's very similar to, what we've seen across the state, which is oftentimes this title gets forgotten about, especially since the state dictates what versions of the codes that you're on. It's just very common to see that everybody kind of forgets that they have this title that sits in their code. And so as we're going through the material here, the general recommendation that we're going to make here is that we fine tune some of the language a little bit in this first 1504 regarding construction codes. And we're going to fine tune that by putting in a reference to where the state adopted construction codes are, which is Title 15A. And then also including that you have some language in here, so that as the state chooses the various versions of those codes, that they adopt, that the city doesn't have to continually come back into this title, and make an update every single time they change the version. That's off with overall maintenance of this section, in order to, help staff out and to help everybody out who's in charge of making sure that the code remains up to date so that you don't have to, basically one less thing you have to worry about in this section. There's also some kind of best practice language that we recommended, that's even inserted into here. An example of which is the conformance with other ordinances, where basically just a general reminder about, that in addition to the building codes, that you also need to, anybody who is doing building or construction, that they also have to make sure that they're complying with subdivision and zoning regulations as well. So you'll see some kind of best practice interjections in there in this title as well. When you get into the 1506, the general provisions, we also recommend that you outline the duties and the roles and responsibility of the building official, and that you also make sure that when you're outlining kind of those roles and responsibilities, that you're also coordinating those with what has been adopted by those building and construction codes by the state, because those building codes, they have an administrative chapter in them, each and every single one of them does. That we'll talk about things like when permits are required, what sort of materials plans need to be submitted for those. There also is some basic roles and responsibilities and duties, that are listed within those. So some of the recommended changes that we've got in this title just ensure that you have a level of consistency and compatibility between the state adopted construction codes and then some of the language that's gonna be found within this code so that they're complementary to each other and aren't, conflicting with each other. So those are some of the interjections that you're gonna see in here, and that's also why you're gonna see in certain sections like building permits, where we've gone in and we've recommended that you strike some language, because what we found when we were looking at this is it's very redundant and in certain instances can conflict with the language that's included within this adopted building and construction codes. So one of the areas that we have that is kind of up for planning commission thoughts and considerations and comments is this chapter 1510. And what we called it is construction waste and toilet facilities. So this is a request that we had from staff to be able to add into the code as a new element. The intent of this section is to give you guys some language in the event that there is a nuisance complaint regarding construction debris or placement of porta potties on construction sites and things like that. So that you actually have some regulations, not onerous regulations, but just some basic regulations, so that when you do have a construction dumpster that's out on a construction site, if there's litter and other things that are blowing around on the site, that staff has the ability and has the language in the code, so that they get in contact with whoever it is that's responsible for that site in order to be able to take care of and remedy those nuisance things, and also to provide adequate penalty provisions in the instance that you have somebody that doesn't want to comply with just basic common sense standards. So if there was an area to kind of focus in on this section to make sure from a policy direction, the planning commission is in consensus with staff on that, this would be a good chapter to take a look at, and for us to get your feedback and your thoughts on. Have you guys had a chance to kind of take a look at some of these red lines, or do you have any thoughts on those topics?
So, back up a little bit higher on the conflict of interest,
Oh, yeah, sure.
which I know it's not yellow or green or anything.
Yeah.
Up higher in the violation, it talks about the building official or his agents.
Right.
Would the conflict of interest also be, his agents? Or just?
Yeah, in a long story short, it could also pertain. So when you get into the building code, the building official actually is when they define the building official, they also talk about, any inspectors, or plan reviewers, or deputies that the building official may need to employ in order to basically administer the building codes.
Okay.
I would say that the conflict of interest provision, depending upon the structure of your actual building department, I think you could construe the conflict of interest to also apply to certain positions in there. So this conflict of interest is a state mandated requirement, but it's a good best practice, and I think it's fair, to keep, when there is a conflict of interest, that you use a neutral third party for either plan review or inspection services. So if we need to alter the language in here to also make sure that it's 100% covered, that it also includes the building officials and, their deputies or appointees, you could add that language in there, or if you don't want it to construe to those, it could also be that you've got a building official, who theoretically can do building inspection and plan review, and you may also have another inspector or another employee in the building division who just does inspection or who just does plan review. If it's conflict for just that one person, the building official may be able to still handle those reviews if it's not a conflict for them, but it is for a certain employee. So if there's clarifications that we need to add into this section or do that, I think there's latitude to do that.
What section were we on again?
So this would be in 1506 OPO. So it's not an existing section, it would be one that we've proposed.
And I wondered on that section if it was too restrictive, that they can't even ask for an interpretation of something on it.
On the conflict.
Yeah, that is the other, like I said, the other policy discussion. I've worked in some jurisdictions that have been small enough, where there has been a conflict of interest, before, and so when you have an applicant that's trying to get something reviewed, that the, building official maybe has a vested interest in, is it really a fair review at that point, or does it make sense to involve third party? I've been in some of those situations where it's been deemed, by the council that, if there is a conflict of interest and they do want to do that or make that requirement. I've also seen other jurisdictions that don't have a need, for this language. So I always propose it as a best practice recommendation, but that is another avenue. If you don't feel that it's needed, we could also just exclude it. So something to ponder on. And we don't have to resolve these today. Just note that you've got, just for the sake of time, because I know we're kind of limited to an hour today. Just know that you've got some places in the code where you can interject those thoughts, and we can get into those discussions and make adjustments to the document one way or the other. So if you guys want to noodle on that one, and then maybe get back to us with kind of a consensus for what the thought there is as to whether or not we need to include those sections or strike it or make any revisions. We're happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Kendall. Let us kick that one around a little bit.
Okay, sounds good. So the rest of the changes that you'll see in this section are actually pretty straightforward. So because the state adopts their specific versions of the building codes, you have a lot of these sections that have now become outdated and they're not needed anymore because of the proposed language that we've got written at the very beginning of the chapter. So that means you can do a lot of consolidating in this chapter. So that's a good thing in our world, Mike, and I think when we can actually delete pages of code, that is no longer relevant and things like that. So that's what you're going to see strike through in the chapters that specifically talk about energy conservation and gas code and all that kind of stuff, because that's all handled by the state adopted building codes. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we got proposed. It's currently going on in the building and construction title. Is everybody okay if we switch gears and if we talk about subdivisions?
So, sure.
Okay. So the subdivisions, so we'll start by saying that there were a lot of changes that the state came down with during the last legislative session. I'm sure you guys may have heard it by now, but everybody talking about Senate Bill 174. Senate Bill 174 had quite an impact on the way in which subdivision applications are reviewed and processed. So to highlight the takeaways from that, Senate Bill 174 came in and said for residential, single family, two family, or townhome development, that you have to use an administrative land use authority when it comes to review and approval of the plats. And then that Senate bill further went in to define an administrative land use authority as a body that is not the legislative body, meaning your city council. So they're basically all the jurisdictions across the state are kind of trying to figure out how to rewrite their subdivision ordinances to be in compliance with that. And the reality of that is if for those types of subdivision plats, if your approver, can't be the city council, the next best thing is the planning commission as serving as the land use authority. And that's actually what we recommended in this draft, so that you're compliant with the state statutes in that regard. The those types of subdivision plats, that it's actually gonna be the planning commission who's gonna be the approving authority, since it can't be, the council. Now, there's one caveat to that. If you have, those types of subdivision, plats, and if they're in a geotechnically sensitive area, sensitive lands, whatever, you can still use the traditional, process, which for most people across the state is the planning commission serves as a recommending body, and then it's ultimately the city council that makes the final, decision, on that plat. So know that you still have that option. You can still require, applications that are in sensitive lands to do that, and that's also what we've recommended in this draft, is that you keep your traditional, review process, for there. Because from a policy standpoint, we think that, with development in those types of areas, there's often some very good ideas that shake out from having it, go through the planning commission and then also through the city council, for its approval. So that's one aspect of Senate Bill 174 is that change. And like I said, it only applies to the residential subdivision plats, that are single family, 2-family, or townhome developments. All of your other plats, so like your commercial plats, and, larger multifamily developments, those can all continue to go through the standard process. And it can be the city council, in those instances, as the approval, body for those subdivision type plats. So and that's kind of what we would recommend, that you kind of continue on with the way things have always been, or the other types of subdivision plats, that you not really mess with any of those approval processes. We looked at those, we feel like those are pretty standard and straightforward, so we didn't do too much meddling, with those process reviews. The other element of Senate Bill 174 is it also requires, what they call review cycles, and it defines how many review cycles, plats can go back and forth, in terms of review comments, and it has a maximum of 4 now. So there's some language that we've had to insert in there in order to address that process, and address that requirement. And then there is also, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Anyway, I'll come back to it. I'm sure it'll come to me what I was going to say, so sorry for that. Okay, so let's look. So we've got kind of the standard clarity, correctness, and we also have some best practice additions. Some of these best practice additions are also just to make sure that you're consistent with how state statute reads. So the relevant portion of state code for this particular title is 10.9A. It's the Land Use and Development Management Act. It's the same title that all the planning commissions get training on constantly. So it's that same title that we're in here. So some of these paragraphs, like effective adopted master plans, the enactment of ordinances and resolutions and developments, that language is being pulled out of that 10.9A title, just so that you've got some consistency happening between those things. There are also some additions like this particular section here for guidelines and checklists, and that's actually what it is that I was going to say. Senate Bill 174, in addition to that, also requires that you make your applications for subdivision and your development checklists and reviews. They have to be made easily accessible to the public, so that they have all of that information. They know what's required of them. In terms of what it takes in order to get a approval for a subdivision plat. So you will see some interjection of some sections in here that are going to speak towards that. And so one of those sections is this guidelines and checklist. So obviously when you have the requirement to generate guidelines and checklists for applications and things like that, it's usually your staff that ends up maintaining those and keeping those up to date. And so this particular section in here is just to give staff some language, so that you have it in the code where it says that staff can come in and can make those changes to those guidelines and checklists whenever they need to, in order to help facilitate, the subdivision review and approval process, so that it's made clear what all the requirements are, for the applicant so that they're in compliance with that, Senate Bill 174. The other addition, that we'd like to add, Mike and I typically like to recommend, that you insert what we call a designation of land use authority chart. Now, that's a lot of really big words, but ultimately at the end of the day, what this is a chart that basically shows all the different flavors of subdivision applications you could have. And at a real quick glance, we'll give you who the reviewing body is, who the recommending body is, who ultimately is the land use authority, and then also what their appeal, who the appeal authority is for those different types of subdivision applications. What we found is that the jurisdictions where we recommended that they insert this into their code, they actually love it at the end of the day, because when they do have developers and public who want to know what the process is, you can give them the sheet. And it very quickly will kind of outline or overview that particular process that they're looking at trying to do. So it just helps them understand, it adds a level of understanding to the code in order to be able to give somebody kind of the overview. And then this chart will actually correspond to the specific written out procedures that you have identified later on in the code. So we actually even have a section in here that we propose to break down and address that Senate Bill 174. So that process for the single family, two family, or townhome projects. Is there a question?
I have a question. On your chart that you're showing us, it talks about the DRC, the Development Review Committee. Is that something new? Does Roosevelt City have a Development Review Committee, or is that something that has to be established?
Remind me, Drew, didn't you guys have language in the existing code for Development Review Committee? Were you guys actually utilizing that? I thought there was.
I don't know if
existing code.
I don't know if it's specified, but we have been basically
Okay.
a preliminary construction committee. We don't necessarily call it the DRC, but
The DRC, okay.
we get all parties involved within our staff for utilities and water sewer services, and let the developer know what they have available. So I guess that would be the same as what you're spelling out there, the DRC.
Yeah, if that's an incorrect label, whatever you are referring to them as, we can make that change on here. We also have worked with jurisdictions that don't actually have a formal DRC, they just utilize city staff. So if city staff is a more appropriate term, instead of calling it a DRC, you can also just substitute city staff for DRC.
Yeah, I think it's in the same, but it's just, we're used to the city staff review, I guess, or.
Well,
Okay.
on page 11, it gives a definition of it.
So Kendall, with that in mind, if you've got the definition and everything, I think we'd be okay just knowing what it is, I guess.
Yeah, let me scroll down to the definitions here real quick. Yeah, so we have, committee established and created by the city council to ensure the proposed use, activity, building, or structure is consistent with the general plan and complies with the requirements of the city's land use zoning subdivision ordinance. Committee members may include representatives from city departments and other persons as may be designated by the council responsible for reviewing and coordinating applications for any land use, application approval, permit, or license. And I feel like there's probably one other section. I have to look, it might be in the zoning title, where you might have actually defined some staff positions that belong to kind of that DRC. The purpose of the definition is kind of give you kind of a little bit of broad range, so that whoever needs to be assigned to the committee can be assigned to the committee. Typically what you'll find, you know, in terms of committee members there is it'll be just like you said, usually there's a representative from engineering, somebody from planning who can answer planning questions, usually the fire marshal's in attendance or somebody at the fire department who, you know, knows enough about the infrastructure that's in play in order to be able to tell them what the requirements are from a fire code perspective. Usually those are the main ones. that end up being involved in there, but I've also seen development review committees that will also include, the city administrator, if there's not a staffed, zoning administrator or planning position, to be able to respond to questions there. I've also seen it where they've included, the mayor or a representative from the council. So it just kind of depends on what each jurisdiction wants to do. And like I said, some aren't even as formal as defining that body, and they just would prefer to use, city staff. So,
And Kendall, we're pretty much utilizing the body that you just spelled out as far as all parties involved. It's just the clarification on what that meant. We've been doing that as far as what you're explaining.
Would you want to just designate it city staff?
Either way, I really, the DRC kind of defines who and gives the leniency to the council to appoint. Where city staff more
Others.
will be on the staff to get all parties involved that need to be, so. It's worked in the past, just having city staff. It's up to you guys how you want that clarified. What's your recommendation? Do you see any pros and cons there, Kendall?
either or, sometimes DRC is a little bit easier term to use, and sometimes it ends up being more consistent for the jurisdiction to actually call it a DRC. Because a lot of times that they'll have the DRC will meet, as a group with the applicant. So sometimes it's easier to refer to them as DRC instead of just city staff. But it's just a preference question. I think, it's apples. It's one of those tomatoes model things, whatever you want to call it.
Can you just put it in parentheses so that until an actual
Yeah.
DRC is created,
Right.
just have city staff in parentheses or something?
Or DRC or city staff?
Yeah. Yep. We can do that.
You guys okay with that?
Okay, so along with that land use authority chart, what we've tried to do is, kind of give you some additional language, to outline processes, because again, that's another area Mike and I frequently find when we look at codes across the state, no matter what the jurisdiction size is, they always kind of, lack content when it comes to actually writing down what the actual review process is, the administrative review process. And the reason for that, I think, is in order to kind of download everybody's brain and to get the process written out actually on paper, or what the typical process is, it can be very tedious. But there's a benefit to going through the tedious effort of actually writing down what the typical review process is. First and foremost, as you have staff that may come and go, planning commissioner members that may come and go, and also city council, members that may come and go. But you actually have those administrative processes written out in the code. It helps ensure a level of consistency, for the public and for developers, so that they kind of know what the bar is, in terms of, what's acceptable, in terms of plans and specifications and all that sort of thing. So you're gonna see a lot of recommended things from us to kind of outline the basic administrative processes. And so what I would say there is, we've kind of had staff take a look at these two, to try to, like I said, incorporate what the typical review process has been for these different, various application types. If there is any updates that we need to do to that, I would say just let us know, so that we can work in all of those details and make sure that we've got the processes actually outlined correctly. That's kind of what you'll find kind of up in this first section, in this section 1601. That's there. So whatever we do, what I will say is whatever we will do, naming wise in terms of DRC, whether it be DRC or the, in parentheses, city staff, you'll probably see me go in here and do a little bit fine tuning. Because I do have some places in some of these processes where I've used that DRC term. So whatever we decide there, I need to make sure, gets incorporated the rest of the way through. But that's why you're gonna see the interjection of so many different sections about, kind of some of the different flavor types of applications and what the process actually is there. So we have added in some additional language, like to address things like development agreements, because the city does have that as an option. That's in state statutes, so there's certain requirements there that you need to follow there. Some of the procedures and that sort of thing, are based off of kind of some best practice recommendations, so, there are some things in there. When we skip into the definition section, a lot of the new definitions that you're gonna see us insert, are going to be to ensure that you have consistency, with state statute, because state statute actually does go through and define some of these terms. So for example, the administrative land use authority, that's actually a defined term in state statute. So we wanna make sure that that definition matches what state statute has. In practice, this helps alleviate a lot of conflicts, sometimes. So that's usually the best practice recommendation that we have from there. So let me keep skimming ahead real quick, and let's take a look at this next section. So 1602, this is where you're gonna see a lot of the process, that I was just talking about. A lot of those paragraphs where they come into play. We have some suggested language that talk about conformity to the regulations, and then also kind of general responsibilities of the developer and also of the city. Like I said, I don't think there's anything too onerous in here, but it just kind of helps to clarify kind of what the where the bar is on certain things. We have some general language regarding application requirements. Again, this is another area where we find that there's not a lot of detail, when it comes to, what general application requirements are. Staff is probably going to find this section kind of more useful, probably than anything else. But this way too, you can also cut down on some of the redundant aspects, where you have to say, I add a section in here that talks generally about fees, that fees are going to be required when you submit an application, and that the fees are determined, by the city's fee schedule. By stating it once, then you can remove all the redundant lines that are found, within code. So some of this too also speaks to kind of doing some consolidation, so that you can cut down on the number of internal conflicts that you may have in the future as things need to update. Along those lines, language generally about abandoned applications, so that you don't, so that staff has, the ability to kick out applications, that the developer or the applicant may not be making a good faith effort, to continue moving that application forward. So you do have some areas in here that I've highlighted in the draft for you, and I've also put summaries on the policy discussion catalogs, where you may want to have some discussions about some of these. For example, like on abandoned applications, and does the city want to allow refund of fees if you've already started review of that application? Sometimes we have jurisdictions that have different feelings on that matter. So if in the proposed language that we've written here, there's a question, where a policy discussion needs to be made, that's going to be kind of this highlighted yellow that you see in here. So as you kind of skim through some of this material, if you want to keep an eye out for that highlighted yellow material, that would be, that would also save you, when you're kind of trying to go through and figure out some of the different red lines that are in here. In terms of some of the subsequent sections that we have on concept plan, preliminary plan, and final plat, the substantive changes that you're going to see there are going to be to address that Senate Bill 174 requirement. There's some additional language that we need to add in, like I said, that addresses that number of review cycles. There's also some requirements that are specific to pre-application and concept plan review for those types of applications. So those are gonna be kind of the highlighted, areas that we have, in here.
Development Review Committee.
So with that, that's kind of what you're gonna see in the subdivision red lines. I know I've been talking at you probably for 45 minutes now, so if it's okay, Drew, I'll probably kick it back to you, and just open it up for general discussions, thoughts, but I feel like that might be beneficial to me. Just to get kind of an initial read, with kind of the approach that we're currently working under, if all of that sounds like we're being fair and reasonable to kind of propose changes, or if we're maybe off base anywhere. I'm also happy to entertain questions, wherever basically you guys want to go with the discussion. I'm here for it, so.
So Kendall, real quick, just give us a little bit of the outlook or time frame of what we would like to see when it comes to the planning commission for the first visual, and then the process of
Yeah,
response, and then final acceptance to the city council. Just kind of go over the timeline. We've got a rigorous schedule from now until February that we're trying to get everything wrapped up between this body and city council on all of the titles they have to do as well.
right, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I did kind of skip right over that. So, obviously this project has been a long time in the works. And so, I think everybody's excited to push forward and get to the finish line on these. To make sure that you've got compliant, code that's compliant with state statutes. There are certain elements of this code update projects that actually have, hard and fast deadlines. This subdivision, title in particular is one of those elements that does have a hard and fast timeline. So, for example, depending upon, and Mike can go speak to this, but, it depends on the size of your jurisdiction and the classification of your county. Folks across the state are either gonna have to make sure that their subdivision ordinance, is updated either by February 1st or for December 1st for the real smaller or rural counties. So that's gonna be kind of the immediate timeline for that, is to, make sure that this changes to the subdivision one probably before February, have been updated, in order for compliance there, just to keep you guys out of trouble with the state. The general consensus is to try to, get the larger code update process wrapped up by the beginning of next year. The first couple of months in there. And so there's really kind of two tracks that we've got set up right now. So, this project was actually for us to go through all titles of the city's code. So with that, there are certain elements, that the planning commission, needs to weigh in on and give recommendation, to the council on. That's required statutorily. That's kind of the process, whenever you're modifying those land use regulations. Along with that, there are also some titles like the finance and the administration sections of the code, that the planning commission doesn't, have a requirement to do the weigh in on those pieces. So we have two separate tracks, right now. The titles, that don't meet the planning commission's, considerations and things like that, those are being plotted, on the council meeting agendas. So that they can go through those, and we can follow the process through on those, particular titles. When it comes to the land use related things, our thought was that we would get together on each of these titles, just kind of like a work session format like we're doing here today, where we can kind of give you the general summary, of what the red lines are for these titles, see if there's, anything, that's an immediate red flag, that we need to potentially go back in, either readdress, correct. And then I think the thought process we're trying to get wrapped up by the first half of, next year is that once we're done with the work session on those titles, if the planning commission is feeling comfortable, that we would go ahead and do the advertisement to get the public hearing, scheduled and actually on the agenda, so that we can hold the public hearing in the planning commission's formal recommendation, because ultimately these do need to go to the council as well, for the council's consideration and adoption.
So Ken, real quick, 15, 16, and 17 will basically be all that will come through this body, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to.
No, we're trying to give you bite sizes, I guess, so we don't, so if we can get 15 and 16 done now. So for the sake of time, we'll try to keep this one to an hour today, but your recommendation on how the commission should move forward and give their recommendation. Basically, the policy discussion catalog, if we go over the bullet points and then dive into the code and see what those changes are, and then make their recommendations, yes or no, or.
Yeah, I think, honestly, from a timing perspective, that's probably gonna be the most beneficial for all involved. We've tried to break down, like I said, I usually start with these two. It may not seem like, that these are workable sections, but in reality they are, because like I said, the majority of the changes that are occurring in these two titles are really to address statutory issues. So the thought was that's the reason why we kind of bundled and put two together. We left Title 17 separately because there's way more latitude in the zoning ordinance where we can actually start crafting some policy, where it's more policy versus, changes to address statutory requirements, I guess. And so inherently, we know that there's probably going to be some more discussion in the zoning title versus these two titles. So that's why you're seeing these two bundled. But that's the reason for the approach behind that. And like I said, I really feel like if usually what we try to do is 2 weeks prior to your meeting date, we'll make the documents available to you so that you guys can review them at your leisure. And then the thought is, like I said, to do a work session on those titles so that we can all get together and talk kind of just like we've done today, to cover things that may need to be changed or answer questions or things like that. And then so long as the planning commission is feeling okay, the next time we get together, actually do a hearing on there so that they can give formal recommendations to the council. And if it ends up being where, just we need to push or we need to hold another work session, I mean, it's not the end of the world if we do need to hold another work session. We just need to kind of be aware of how many additional work sessions, because like I said, the council would like to see this wrapped up by the first part of next year. So we do kind of have to stick to somewhat of a timeline on that.
So with 16 and some of 15, would it be helpful, some of those areas we can't change, right? So there's not a real discussion, it's a mute point for us to even get in with our own thoughts because we are held by the SB 174. Would it be helpful to color those a different color potentially so we don't waste a bunch of time on that?
Yeah, we could. I also did that on the policy discussion catalog, I thought, where I interjected some highlights as to where we are looking for. I've got kind of a general one highlighted here, so I can actually find one.
There's not a lot of them.
Yeah, I can either call them out in a different color or I can add a line on here. I can do the highlight on the policy discussion catalog. Whatever would be easier for the planning commission, whether or not they want to see it, the red lines are on the summary sheet, which is the policy discussion catalog.
I think that would help if you call that out, even on the policy catalog, just in the description there.
Yeah, I can give you some prompting, not a problem.
Thank you. Okay, any questions?
I know. Okay.
Ren, do you have any questions? You've been quiet. You don't have any pizza to eat either.
I had a hamburger, so I stuck my mouth full of that.
Perfect. Okay.
I was gonna say, how does everybody feel? Like, hopefully we didn't overwhelm you guys too much. We really try not to, but to a certain extent, I mean, we're always gonna kind of have that overwhelming feeling. Is everybody feeling okay, kind of with the general direction of this? Is that?
That's a loaded question, Cal.
I know, I'm sorry, I don't have to ask loaded questions.
So, yeah, I got a better understanding now of where.
You may not be able to hear, they said that it's been very helpful. Also.
Okay. Yeah, just know that we're here to help. So if you do have questions, if it makes more sense, to, drop us an email or to call me and say, hey, I got questions. We're more than happy to answer those, questions. Or like I said, if we need to, have another discussion on this, I'm happy to help. So whatever you guys need, just know that I'm here for you, so.
So I think the general plan will be to take these in our next meeting, try to move forward and address any corrections or any modifications that the commission may feel. And then we can push that on to the city council the next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
What's that Senate Bill
174.
174?
And we've got a copy of that, or we can email that out to
Yeah,
you.
yeah, the email.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I've got a copy of it too. I can send it to you.
If you would, that would be great.
Yep, can do.
All right, thank you, Mike and Kendall. Appreciate your time.
No problem. Catch you guys later.
Okay. Well, what's your thought? Heading in the right direction?
Well, I didn't see a whole lot of things that need my attention.
Oh, thank you.
There's not a lot with this body. It's basically, we're kind of governed by the new legislation, especially in chapter 16. The 15-1, historically, we've tried to identify on our own the building standards and the building code rather than just identifying what the state has adopted. It's so much easier just to adopt, because we're being held by the IRC, the state adopts the building code. We just roll with what the state does without trying to do it on our own. That was the confusion on that, since we.
How long is that? Is that 60 pages?
The building code,
The state building code, is
it's about 1,000.
it's booked.
International Residential Code and the IBC, the International.
Okay.
Building Code.
Plus all the amendments.
Yeah, and appendices and everything, it's so stacked, it looks that big. Then the state, what happens, we just barely adopted the 2021 for Utah. That's how far behind we are.
Okay.
We've been under the 2015 before that.
As a Roosevelt City, you're saying?
No,
No,
it's
state.
Utah.
As the state of Utah?
Yeah, so what happens is Utah, they have, as states, they have the option, and it's political, homeowner builders associations and lobbyists, they sit on the hill in positions where they have the latitude of saying, no, we want this stricken out of the international code, and this is what Utah is gonna amend. So they can actually take and amend things out, and some of them are good, some of them aren't good, it just depends on what side of the fence you're on. That's why they're so far behind.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot to it. So anyway, well, good deal. You guys will do a little homework, I guess. You kind of know the process, and the next meeting, if we can come together and move forward. So,
Sunshine,
Yes, sir.
can you print off the full thing for me?
Both titles.
Yeah,
I
please.
understand if you really want it.
you want to print it, or you want to email it?
Print it. I've got it on email. But I-
Like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
just like that. I'm more of a paper guy than electronic. I saw all those places where you could write comments. I'm like, man, I just don't care.
Yeah, just give me like
Print out.